Well, it has been determined that the National Weather Service has decided to send out a survey team to the storm damage in Oroville. Now, over time, as we kind of go through time, you're going to be hearing some different phrases, such as a downburst or winds coming from a tornado. Well, I want to talk to you of the differences between the two. But before we get into that, let's just take a quick look at some of the storm damage. Now, this is courtesy of Justin Stillman. I want to thank him for these images here, but there you can see some of the branches from the apartment complex or around the apartment complex that we can see on the ground. Another thing that was found on the ground were several shingles as well, so that tells us that the winds were strong enough to at least blow the shingles off the roof and create some of that roof damage. We also had a carport that was close to the storm, and of course pretty much demolished there, and there were uprooted trees. Now, one of the things I would like to mention about uprooted trees, especially when we have a couple of days of rain, is that the ground is very soft and saturated at that point. So it takes a little bit less energy to kind of push that tree over, but we're still talking very strong winds to really have to do that. But just something to kind of keep in mind is that we did have a very saturated ground. But this wasn't the only tree that was blown over and uprooted. There were several others in the area. So let's talk about the different phrases that you're going to hear about. Number one, I want to talk to you about a downburst. You may be hearing about that expression. So what sets up a downburst? Well, first you have to have a thunderstorm, right? So you have this upward, or should we say an updraft. It's a strong updraft, right? And that's what helps to create the thunderstorm. Over time, as the thunderstorm weakens or the updraft weakens, what you have is this cold air that builds right here in the middle of the storm. It's this bubble of air, right? This is just cold air. Now, eventually, as this updraft weakens, we see this colder air just really flow down to the surface. You get this strong surge of air, and it creates very strong winds. Now, some of the things to take into account is where you are in relation to this downburst. If you're over on this side of the downburst, what's going to happen is all the trees and all the debris is going to be in one direction. So that's easy for a surveyor to look at and say, oh, this is from a downburst or from straight line winds. The winds are all blowing in one direction. However, if you're in the middle of all this, what happens? Well, all the trees and everything else is blowing in all different directions. Now, at first, that would lead someone to believe that, oh, it's from a tornado, right? Because the tornadoes spin, the winds go in all different directions, and it's blowing things in all different directions. It's not necessarily the case, again, because if you're in the middle of this, these trees are being blown down in all different directions. So that's something to take into account. Now, you have subsets of what a downburst is, right? So let's talk about a microburst. Now, a microburst is if the downburst is 2.5 miles wide or less. And if you have a downburst that is over 2.5 miles, it's called a macroburst. So you're going to hear these terms as well. Was it a microburst? Was it a macroburst? Or was it just a downburst in general, right? So those are some of the terms that you're going to hear. Now, before we go into talking about tornadoes, I want you to take this into account. Look at the nature of this wind. You see how it's pushing down? So it's taking anything that's in its path and it's pushing it down to the ground. So when you see that progression, you see trees that are laid down onto the ground, that may be one indication that it's a downburst. However, that being said, notice what happens with the air. You can kind of get a little bit of rotation and circulation at the outer edges here, and that can create a little bit of uplift in some areas, and that can create some different types of damage. However, the main theme here is that the winds are blowing down and it's blowing everything in its path down to the ground. All right, now let's talk about a tornado. I'm not necessarily going to talk to you about the formation of a tornado, but what happens with a tornado is the winds come in from all directions and they kind of get to the center of the storm. They kind of get sucked up into the storm, and of course with that rotation. So the winds come in and then they start to rotate within that rotation here, right? So think of it this way. If you have a tree here, it's going to try to get lifted up. So you're going to see branches break off, kind of get caught up within that flow, sucked up into the tornado, and then spun around and then maybe blown off in different directions, right? So if you have large debris that gets caught up in that flow, it gets sucked up into the storm, gets lifted up, gets caught up in that rotation and then can get flung sometimes over a mile from the storm system itself and from the tornado itself. So, downburst, winds blowing down, blowing things down to the ground. With a tornado, the wind's kind of sucking up, kind of bringing that air into the storm itself, and anything in its path is kind of getting sucked up into the storm and then caught into the rotation. And then sometimes if it's kind of taken into the storm, it can get kind of flung out from the tornado, like I said, sometimes over a mile or several miles from the storm. So there are certainly different things you're going to be hearing about. There are a lot of things for the National Weather Service to take into account when they are at the site for the damage. But of course, keep it right here to Weather NorCal. I'll have the latest on my weather updates and of course on Facebook and social media to let you know what the overall decision was. Was the damage in Oroville from a tornado or from a downburst? We'll be finding out that here later. In the meantime, have yourselves a great day.